The sun had risen, but the night wasn't over. The sunlight was filtering in through the window. The house was bright, but the weight inside me was still there. The file was on the table. Its cover was open. I didn't go near it, because I had noticed something. I wasn't looking at the file. The file was looking at me. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. The silence was full. I brewed coffee. I did this deliberately. I thought if I did something normal, everything would return to normal. As the steam from the coffee rose, I turned my back to the file. There was no sound behind me. This was worse. I thought of logical explanations. An old house, an old file, a stupid note left behind by the previous tenant. But the writing in the file, it didn't know my name. It knew me. When I sat back down at the table, I noticed something new. There were no page numbers, but the content was in order. As I kept reading, the pages were increasing. They hadn't existed before I read them. The file wasn't static. It was alive, and it was reacting. On one page, there was a single sentence written in capital letters. There is no return. Below it, in smaller text, only forward. Forward to where? I heard a sound in the house, this time not from the house, from inside the wall. I looked at the clock, 3:08. It was daytime. That was impossible. I checked my phone. The screen was pitch black, but on the lock screen there was only one thing written, 3:17. It was showing a time that hadn't arrived yet. When I sat back down at the table, the leg of the chair made a faint sound. Normally I wouldn't have cared, but now, every sound pierced my ears. I didn't look at the file, on purpose, because I had realized something. The more I looked at it, the closer it came to me. I placed my hands on my knees, took a deep breath. The house was silent. But this silence wasn't empty, as if something was listening to me. I spoke quietly, very quietly. What do you want? My words hung in the air. I wasn't expecting an answer. There shouldn't have been one. Files don't answer. But the paper moved on its own. One corner lifted slightly, then slowly settled back down. My heart sped up. My eyes drifted to the cover. I could have closed it, still, but I didn't. Because at that moment, the sound of the paper was heard. A page turned by itself. That sound was the kind that makes you feel like someone is in the room. A new line appeared, not in ink, as if it was emerging from within the paper. You're asking the wrong question. My throat tightened. That sentence hadn't been there. I was sure of it. It hadn't been there a few seconds earlier. My hand trembled. Well, I said. This time my voice was a little louder. What should I ask? The answer didn't come immediately. It waited. It waited for me. Then the letters appeared again, slowly, deliberately. How long you can endure. That's when I realized this file wasn't giving information. It was testing. And the test had already begun. The sentence was there. How long you can endure. I didn't take my eyes off the line because I knew that if I did, something would be behind me. I took a deep breath. My chest tightened, as if the air inside the house had grown a little heavier. Endure? I said. This time I didn't whisper. I deliberately raised my voice. I wanted to hear my own voice, to remember that I was real. The file remained silent for a while. As that silence stretched on, I began to hear my heartbeat inside my ears. Then, new letters appeared at the bottom of the page, one by one, as if there was no rush. Everyone who is accepted asks the same question. Accepted. That word made my stomach churn. Who was here before me? I asked. The moment the question left my mouth, a sound came from inside the house, very faint, as if someone had dragged their foot from upstairs. But upstairs, there shouldn't have been anyone. The file answered, but this time the writing had changed. It was harsher, clearer. They are no longer here. Did they leave? I asked. A brief silence. Then a single word was written. No. That word explained nothing, yet it told everything. A cold sweat ran down my back. The file added one final line. Some couldn't endure. That's when I understood. This wasn't a story. This was a process of elimination. And the turn had come to me. I flinched at the sound of the door. Solid, clear, real. I looked at the file. There was no new line, as if it had fallen silent. It was listening to me. I stood up. There was a slight tremble in my legs. As I walked toward the door, I felt the house closing in on me. The hallway was longer than usual. My footsteps echoed. I opened the door. An old man stood in front of me. He was wearing an old coat. It wasn't appropriate for the season, but his face was tired, and his eyes far too awake. He was holding a key in his hand. The mailboxes got mixed up, he said. His voice was calm, but his tone was unusual. He held out the key. When my hand touched it, his fingers were ice cold, not normal. Did you just move into this house? He asked. Yes, I said. He paused for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. Don't start asking questions, he said. That was all he said. There was no before it, no after. Just as he was about to turn away, he stopped and added, At night, don't turn off the lights. I didn't ask why, because his eyes told me this. If you ask, I'll have to explain. I closed the door. When I turned around, the file was open. There was a new line. He had been accepted too. That's when I understood. This house wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. After closing the door, I couldn't move for a long time. My hand was still on the doorknob, ice cold, as if the cold outside the house had seeped in through the metal of the door. I took a deep breath, but the breath didn't fully fill my lungs. I slowly turned around. The file was on the table, open. The light was hitting it, but the pages were dark. This was intentional. The shadow was deliberately there. I walked toward the table. With every step, the floor creaked softly, as if the house was recording my footsteps. I sat down in the chair. This time, I didn't rush. Before looking at the file, I looked around, at the walls, at the ceiling, at the window. There was nothing, but everything was too much. Do you know him? I said. My voice was quieter than I expected. The file didn't answer. There was silence for a while. This silence wasn't the kind I was used to. It was a waiting silence. Then the writing appeared, slowly, letter by letter. There were others before him as well. I couldn't swallow. "How many people?" I asked. The answer was delayed, on purpose. "The number doesn't matter." That answer frightened me even more, because if the number didn't matter, there were replacements. I turned the page. A new section heading appeared. The accepted. There were blank lines underneath, but the names slowly began to appear. Some were faint, some were crossed out, and at the very bottom, a blank line. That line belonged to me. I noticed the sound of the clock. It had never been this clear before. Every second was driven in like a nail. I lifted my head and looked at the clock. It was 3:13, daytime. But the room had darkened. The curtains weren't closed. The power hadn't gone out. The light had simply withdrawn. The writing in the file began to change. It was trembling, as if it was struggling to remain fixed. "Time is running out." When this sentence appeared, a sound came from inside the house. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a breath, right next to my ear. There was no one behind me, but the sound was there. "Elias." It said my name, this time not in writing, in sound, a real voice. I froze. My heart was beating so fast that my breathing faltered. The file wrote once more, "You started to hear our voice." The clock turned to 3:15. My hands were sweating. I stood up, stepped back. I could have closed the file, but I knew this was no longer about a cover. This was a threshold, and thresholds are only noticed once they are crossed. The time reached 3:16. One final sentence appeared in the file. "1 minute from now, you won't be alone." The second hand of the clock moved forward, 03:16, approaching 03:17, and the house began to breathe. The second hand of the clock was moving forward. Every sound echoed inside my chest. 3:16. Just 1 minute. But that 1 minute wasn't a normal minute. Time was stretching. The room hadn't grown darker. The light was still there. But it felt as if the light no longer belonged to the room. I moved closer to the table. The file was open. The pages were gently rippling. There was no wind. The window was closed. But the paper was breathing. I took a deep breath, but the air filling my lungs wasn't enough. "What will happen?" I said. This time, I wasn't asking a question. I was preparing. The file didn't answer. No writing appeared. This had never happened to me before. As the silence stretched on, a faint hum began in my ears, as if somewhere far away a generator was running, or a heart, the heart of the house. I looked at the walls. They were flat, but for a moment I saw them move. They were coming closer and pulling away, slowly, with a movement that didn't want to be noticed. The time passed, 3:16. The seconds grew heavier. Every second was screaming at me to decide. I could have closed the file. I stood up. My hand reached for the cover. At that moment, a deep sound rose from within the house. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't speech. It was a breath that filled the entire house. And then, not yet. The voice had come from directly behind me. When the time changed exactly, nothing happened. This was the most terrifying part. No explosion, no light, just a deep silence. Then, inside the file, a single word was written, in capital letters, accepted. The moment I saw that word, the room spun. I had to sit down. Not on the chair, on the floor. The floor was cold, but the cold was comforting. It was real. Sounds began to come from inside the house, but this time they weren't random. Footsteps, more than one. Upstairs, in the hallway, inside the walls, but no one was visible. New pages began to form in the file, one after another. As if something had been unlocked, a new heading appeared. Interaction has begun. Below it, a small note. We will no longer ignore you. That's when I realized this wasn't a curse. This was an agreement, and I had signed it. A sound came from near the door, the sound of a key turning slowly, but the door was locked. One final sentence was written in the file. Now we will know you. And the lights went out at the same time. When the lights came back on, everything was in its place. The table, the chairs, the walls. But the house wasn't the same house. It was hard to describe, as if the house now knew me. I stood up. There was a heaviness in my legs, as if gravity had increased. I looked at the file. There were new pages, but this time, they weren't waiting for me. They were already written. The heading was clear: Post-0317 Protocols. Below it were bullet points. The first, Rule 3, the file can no longer be hidden. What did that mean? I looked around. The file was on the table, open, and I couldn't close it. I placed my hand on the cover, but the paper had hardened, like stone. A second point appeared. Rule 4, the house is an observation area. This time, it wasn't my heart that tightened, but my awareness. So the house was now a stage, and I was an actor. The door knocked once more, but this time, it wasn't unexpected. As I walked to the door, my footsteps didn't echo. The house swallowed sound. I opened the door. The old man was there again, but this time he wasn't holding a key. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked inside. He saw the file. He said nothing. He lowered his head. "You're late," he said. His voice was tired, but that tiredness wasn't about time. "How many years?" I asked. His eyes filled. "I stopped counting," he said. Then he added, "The file didn't abandon me. I abandoned the file." That sentence carved itself into my mind. "After 317, he continued, you either live with it or live for it." Before leaving through the door, he turned back and said this, "They noticed you." I didn't ask who they were. I already knew the answer. I closed the door. The house was silent, but this silence was now familiar. I turned back to the file. A new heading appeared. This time, there was no ornamentation. Purpose. Below it, there was a single sentence. to separate those who remember. What did that mean? The file continued. Those who forget are safe. Those who remember are necessary. That's when I realized. The file wasn't gathering information. It wasn't conducting experiments. It was making a selection. And I had been selected. The final line appeared at the very bottom, in the space that had been left blank. Elias, status, active. The file closed itself. But this wasn't an ending. A sound rose from inside the house. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was like a choir, more than one voice, all saying the same sentence. Welcome. And in that moment, I understood. Chapter 2 was over, but the story was just beginning.